Hi, I'm Holly Tallman. Welcome back to How To Tuesdays and welcome back to our channel. Today we're covering how to wood burn fur. Let's get started. Today we're going to work on wood burning fur. Now, whether you're just getting started or you're an experienced burner, fur is one of the hottest techniques that come up in wood burning. So today we're going to work through some of the secrets that I have to getting through and getting the most realistic fur that you can get on your piece of artwork. So to get started, the first thing we're going to talk about is layout. It's really important that once you start your layout that you really pay attention to two main factors: your lighting and your focus. These two elements, when laying out your drawing, can make or break how easy it is to transfer an image. Before you start, make sure you have a good quality image, one that doesn't pixelate if you blow it up. That way you can always blow it up for reference if you need it with your drawing. So today we're working with Clyde. Now Clyde, our model here, is a rescue found at Aspen Valley. If you'd like more information, I'll post the link in the description below. You can go and visit, feel free to donate. He's ready to be our model for our burning. Now, as you can see, Clyde has a number of different fur textures, colors, focus and not in focus. And so these are all factors that we're going to talk about today. While you're working through which lines you're going to include in your drawing or your transfer, try and keep in mind that things that are in high contrast are usually dictating a light focus. And light focus is important so that it doesn't change between one part of your drawing and the next. It's important for all your lighting to match in order to make it look realistic. The next thing you're going to look at is your focus, or something that is very sharp is telling you that it's close in range and in focus. And if it is not, then it's set farther back. You'll notice that these things are kind of blurry or out of focus. So you really want to look at your piece of artwork when you're laying it out. So while talking about being in focus and having our cut lines, it's important for you to note that as you lay out your drawing, it is not important to lay out every single stroke of hair. This is where you have the artistic license to create some of your own textures and use your technique with your pen in order to create the lifelike version of your art that you want to create. This is also where the artistic license allows you to create something a little more cartoony or more realistic, add more wet fur as opposed to dry fur, or more dry fur as opposed to wet fur, based on the technique you use. To get started on our wood burning, I've already laid out our drawing, and as you can see, I focused on those highlights that we talked about already. So I made sure that all around the nose was covered, in and around the eyes, but then those dark patches that we talked about are laid out, and around the nose, the highlighted areas in the wet, the high contrasted area between the chin and his chest, and of course the dark elements that you can find in between the fur, and of course the outer line to mark where our image stops. So it looks, when laid out, something a little bit like this. Now again, as you can see, and as we talked about earlier, you won't find many stroke marks in between those highlighted areas or high contrasted areas like I had spoke about. I prefer to do my own techniques and treat the fur as if it's the artwork itself, and so that gives me the creative ability to add what I want where I want it. However, with that being said, because this image is of an animal that I am trying to replicate, what you want to do is make sure that you get the defining details of that animal. So for Clyde has some smoky eyes. Both eyes are different. He's got some smoky eye in the right eye, and he's got some nice clear focus in the left. He also is wet along the bottom and dry on top because he was taking a drink. So these are the features that you want to make sure that you do include in your artwork, because it is what makes the artwork look or resemble like the photograph itself. We're going to start on the area underneath his lip right here. So what this will allow us to do is see where his bottom lip, the bottom of his nose starts and the bottom of his lip starts. Now I did draw a little guideline here. You can barely see it, but this guideline right here is actually this part of his mouth. And that's that high contrasted area right there. So we're going to just take a moment and we're going to put it in there. Now there are two different strokes as we spoke about before. There is the cut stroke, which would be cutting into the wood and creating fur lines. And then there's the, I call it the push stroke, but it's a shading stroke. And essentially it's where you're rubbing the wood as opposed to cutting into it to allow for shading. So for the purpose of this big open area, we're going to use our shade technique so that we can put in the dark parts of his lip. We're just going to put a few in here, different colors. Now, what I like to share when you're doing wood burning, any type of wood burning, but especially with fur, is that the best way to create some of these details is to build them. So you can always go darker, but you cannot go lighter without sanding or adding non-wood burning media, such as white chalk or pastel. So it's important that you always start out light, putting in your details, and then go over them and make them darker or build them so that you can see where your highlights and your lowlights are. Now, as you can see, I'm still using that push technique, but what I'm doing is I'm dragging it. So I'm setting my pen down and dragging backwards. What this kind of gives you is a skewed line, and that skewed line gives you an indent or a shading point at the tip, and then it levels off and lightens up through the end. And what that does is it gives you a little bit of depth where the fur starts or the shadow starts to where the fur ends. I prefer to put the shading technique in first and then go over and add solid lines and highlights and lowlights in order to make the thing real, like the look realistic. The difference between this area on the bear and this area on the bear, although this is still a little bit in focus, it is not as in focus as the mouth, and so you can tell that the front is closer than the back. But the other thing that you'll notice is that the fur is longer. So it's important for you to identify that this fur is shorter than this fur, so that when you're creating your fur, your stroke matches the length of your fur. So if you're going to put in longer hair, your stroke also has to be longer. So you can set your pen down and drag it just like we were doing before, but your stroke length is going to be much, much larger. Pay attention to direction. So this bear's hair clearly flows down the side of his face. Okay, whereas these strokes are kind of sporadic in the fact that they go down and to the side, down, out. There's some wispy, crazy ones up here. So these ones don't have to be quite as, you don't have to pay attention to them quite as much because they're kind of overlapping. But over here, you want to make sure that they're all going the same direction and that you're not overlapping a hair highlight spot while you're going over your strokes. So again, it's important to keep your, we call it our research, but the image in which you are trying to copy, it's important to keep it side by side. So I'll give you an example of a shaded spot. Here's an area where there's a lot of depth, so it's a little bit darker. So as mentioned, we're going to push and pull. And if you'll notice that you can't see a lot of the actual fur lines. There's not a lot of texture in there. So it's important that you're not putting it in. If you don't see it, don't burn it. So when we talked about building, so you'll see that from this spot here, it has the really dark spots here and in the center, and then there's this highlight in here. And I've mimicked that here. I have my dark spot, my dark spot, and my light spot. But you'll notice that I'm not quite finished yet because this is much lighter than this here. And often what I find in most artwork is that the difference between a good and a great piece of artwork is the level of contrast or the level of tonal range that a piece has. So don't be afraid to go back over it and burn it a little bit darker. You build that shade mark, you build that color until you are content that it matches your image, or you are satisfied with the artistic changes that you're making to it. Separate the out of focus fur or the deep fur and the in focus fur. Okay, so again, we're talking about our somewhat in focus, our focus, and now we're going to work on one that's completely out of focus. So using your shading tip, the one that you've chosen, because there are many different types. Mine just happens to be a spear that's bent. You'll find the area that has out of focus fur. So again, your in focus furs, your medium focus furs, and then your out of focus fur. And what you're going to use for that is your shading technique. One of my favorites, and that's shading in round. So we'll find our spot. So here's our highlights. Here are our layout markings that tell us where that is. You can hardly see them because of my camera, but they're relatively right there. And so we're going to move over roughly about an inch over, and we're going to start rubbing in circles. Now what this does is gives you a shade no different than if you were doing skin. However, based on the dark and light areas, it will give the appearance of out of focus fur. And again, we're talking about building. So here in this area, we've got a medium color going on, and this is actually really deep, but this is more of a medium. So we have our medium color here, and we have a darker color here. So if this is our dark, then we've got to, but right now it's medium, so we got to move over. We'll build our medium base first. And then we can build on our dark spot. And now, as you see, out of focus patch, just like over here. Now, as we build across the bear, you will be able to identify where things start and stop. So I'm going to work a little bit on this, and I'm going to fast forward through and see until we can get to our next topic. So thanks for joining me today, and that is your tutorial on secrets to fur. I'm Holly Tallman, and I look forward to seeing you next week.